Ginger Pie, Chapter 1. The Pyes and Pets. Would Gracie the cat be jealous if the Pyes got another pet, a dog? That was what Jerry Pie wanted to know and what he was dreaming about as he sat with his sister Rachel on their little upstairs veranda. Gracie had belonged to the family for 11 years. This was longer than Rachel, age 9, or Jerry, age 10, had. She had been a wedding present to Mama, and she was known in the neighborhood as the New York cat. Jerry was trying to imagine what Gracie's feelings would be if the Pies did get another pet, a dog. The one thing that Jerry Pie wanted more than anything else in the world right now was a dog. Ever since he had seen the new puppies over in Speedy's barn, he was not only more anxious than ever to have a dog, he was most anxious to have one of these Speedy puppies. He had the particular one picked out that he would most like to have as his own. This was not easy to do, for they were all wonderful. Jerry had chosen this special puppy because he was convinced he was the smartest of all the new puppies. Naturally, he would love any dog he had, but imagine owning such a smart puppy as this one. When he owned him, he would teach him how to heel, to be a dead dog, to sneeze, scratch his stomach when Jerry scratched his back, beg, and walk on his hind legs. If he had this dog, it is. And he looked speculatively at Gracie the cat, who had pushed open the screen door and was now lolling with an agreeable expression on the rope mat. He would not want to hurt her feelings, and he thought some more whether it would or would not hurt Gracie's feelings if he brought a puppy into the house. It was Friday evening, and Jerry and Rachel had been sitting reading on the little upstairs veranda of their tall house. Rachel had The Secret Garden from the library, and Jerry had one of the Altschuler books, and neither one of these books was an I book. They both always opened a book eagerly and suspiciously, looking for first to see whether or not it was an I book. If it were, they would put it aside, not reading it until there was absolutely nothing else. Then at last they would read it. But being an I book, it had to be awfully good for them to like it. Only a few, Robinson Crusoe, Treasure Island, and Swiss Family Robinson, for example, survived the hard I book test. These were among their best beloved in spite of the obvious handicap. The children had been reading for a long time, but then it had grown dark. Now they were just sitting quietly, thinking, and watching the bats and bugs hurl themselves against the tall street lamp, which had suddenly come on and was casting a purple glow. Jerry was getting ready to bring up the matter of the dog to discuss with his sister Rachel, but first he liked to sit and dream about what a wonderful idea it was. Rachel and Jared, called Jerry Pie, were very close companions. Of course, they had many friends too. For instance, Dick Badger, who lived next door and had a huge gray hound that knew how to scratch his stomach when you scratched his back, was Jerry's best friend. Rachel's best friend was a girl over on Bugle Street named Addie Egan. All the boys and girls in grade 5 said Addie Egan had cooties, and she really didn't have cooties at all. Rachel stuck up for Addie whenever the occasion arose and said, "Let Addie sign your character books. She does not have cooties." But then Rachel stuck up for everybody who was picked on. There was a little girl named Evie Powers in the next block, and sometimes the older boys and girls picked on her. "Police, come get Evie!" they would cry, trying to scare the wits out of Evie. But Rachel, if she heard them, would call out, "Police, don't get Evie!" And she would run and put her arms around the little girl. Evie just worshipped Rachel and wanted to be with her every minute. This was a nuisance, for Evie wasn't even up to onesies in the game of onesie-twosies, and Rachel was up to fivesies. But Evie had to be protected nonetheless. Rachel would give her a smile and a pat and say, "Don't worry, Evie, I won't let the police get you." Then she would run off and find Addie or Jerry or Dick or someone her age, leaving Evie wiping her eyes and looking after her adoringly. Rachel was an eager, skinny little girl who almost always wore skirts and blouses that didn't even stay tucked in, or sweaters, and her nose was frequently runny because she had hay fever. Jerry was skinny too, but his nose didn't run. Jerry had black hair, and Rachel's was reddish gold, though at this moment, sitting under the street lamp, the hair of both of them looked purple. To lead up to the subject that was nearest to his heart, Jerry said, "Rach, what's more important, a dog or a cat?" Rachel and Jerry were in the habit of having discussions as to what was most important of anything. The most important, or the prettiest, or the best, or the funniest. For instance, in the dictionary, almost their only picture book except for Mr. Pye's book of birds, they had excited discussions over which was the prettiest fish on the shiny colored page of fish, or the prettiest bird or butterfly. One of the favorite discussions of theirs was the one they had whenever they played train, calling out like conductors, "New York to Boston!" Which was more important, they asked each other, New York or Boston? New York, Jerry would say, because it has the Museum of Natural History in it. Boston, said Rachel, because it sounds more important. Why? It just does. Rachel couldn't explain the reason she thought Boston sounded more important than New York, but it probably had something to do with the roundness of the letters, the B and the O's. For the same reason, she thought London sounded more important than Paris, though Paris sounded prettier. Sometimes, since Jerry was 1 year older than she wondered if she too should not say New York. Still, to her, Boston sounded rounder, bigger, more solid, more important. Their town, Cranberry, was between these two big cities. The trains went streaking past, running back and forth from Boston to New York and from New York to Boston. Mama was from a little town near New York, and Papa was from Boston. This made it doubly hard to choose the more important. How had Papa met Mama when they were at two different ends of the railroad? It happened this way. Papa was much older than Mama. He was 35 when he met Mama, and up till then he had not had a minute to get married because all he thought about was birds, birds, birds. Already he was quite a famous birdman. Well, one day Papa happened to be standing in a New York subway station. Though he came from Boston, he had frequent business in New York. In this particular subway station, there was an escalator, and all of a sudden Papa decided to see if he could run up the escalator. Not the up escalator, the down one. He would have to run pretty fast to beat the stairs that were trying to bring him back downwards. Papa said he had always wanted to try this, but naturally he did not want to make a fool of himself in front of other people, of whom there were plenty in New York. This time, however, there weren't any other people around, and it was a splendid opportunity. So up he flew, several steps at a time, and he did manage to reach the top. It so happened that when panting, Papa did reach the top, there was a certain young girl who was about to come down the escalator, and here Papa came racing up it so fast he couldn't help it. He knocked the young lady down. Now this girl happened to be Mama, who had come to the city for an opera matinee. The opera was Tannhauser, the first she had ever seen, and she was floating through the air. Almost, she was so transported by the magnificent music, when all of a sudden she landed flat on her back, knocked over by this crazy man who was flying up the down escalator. Well, of course, since Mama was such a little thing and wore only a size 2 shoe, and moreover ate like a bird, Papa had to marry her. They fell in love at first sight, and though she was only 17, they got married as soon as all the permissions could be granted. It was the most interesting way for a mother to meet a father of any that Rachel and Jerry had heard so far. Addie Egan's mother had met her father at the high school prom, for example, and Dick Badger's mother had met his father at a Sunday school picnic, and so it went. At any rate, this is how it happened that Rachel and Jerry had the youngest mother in the town of Cranberry, and the youngest grandmother, and the youngest uncle, their Uncle Benny, Mama's baby brother, who was now only 3 years old. Here's a picture of Papa running up the down escalator. Papa and Mama came to Cranberry to live so that Papa could study birds of the marshes and the woods and the fields, and because Cranberry was in the middle between New York and Boston. Perhaps they too could not make up their minds which was more important, New York or Boston, and had to settle halfway. After a while, Grandma and Grandpa moved to Cranberry too, so that Uncle Benny would grow up knowing his niece and nephew, Rachel and Jerry, and none of them would be strangers to any of them. Grandpa was a piano tuner, and he said he had just as lief tune pianos in Cranberry as wherever he was, and moreover, he could have a boat in Cranberry, which he couldn't do in New York. Sometimes Rachel and Jerry asked Grandpa which he thought was more important, New York or Boston, and between plinking the piano keys, he'd say New York. But then naturally, being from there, he couldn't be a traitor and say Boston. After Rachel had been taken to both cities, New York and Boston, finding them both wonderful, she didn't know what to say in the importance game. To keep it interesting, however, she continued to say Boston. What would be the sense of both her and Jerry saying New York? There would not have been any game at all then. And anyway, the name Boston still sounded more important. It was Papa who had taken Rachel on her first visit to Boston, and it was Mama who had taken her on her first visit to New York. The time she went to Boston with Papa happened to be over Thanksgiving weekend, just a few years before this story begins. They were to spend the weekend with an old aunt of Papa's, Auntie Hoyt, who had been first to steer Papa towards birds. She was a spinster aunt, and she was very old and fragile, and Papa was very fond of her. The weekend was a cold, raw, and bleak one. Rachel slept on a small cot in the parlor, and she couldn't get warm the whole night. She didn't have enough covers, and her feet wouldn't warm up. She stayed awake, and thought, though she scrunched herself up into a tight little ball, she still stayed cold. Since Aunt Auntie Hoyt was poor. Rachel imagined she didn't have any more covers in the cupboard, and she felt she shouldn't embarrass her by asking for more. Anyway, she didn't want to be a nuisance and wake anybody up, so she shivered and shook. Also, she didn't want Papa to think he had such a cold daughter he could not possibly take her on any more trips. Rachel longed to go on bird trips with Papa, to the coldest north and the hottest south, and traipse through the swamps of Florida. She had to be stoic. It must have been about 3 in the morning before she ever fell asleep. The next night, as Rachel was getting ready for bed, she viewed the cold couch of night with horror. She felt she couldn't stand the cold any more another minute. Papa was reading the Auk, and Auntie Hoyt had a little book of forget-me-nots. Whispering so Auntie Hoyt could not hear her, and hoping the question would not fill Papa with such disgust that he would never take her to Labrador, she asked Papa where they hung her overcoat. She planned to sleep in it. Then he and Auntie Hoyt, who had heard, were sorry and piled 100 coats on her couch. She was still cold, though, and couldn't get her feet to warm up the whole time she was there in Boston. Here's a little picture of her asking Papa, whoops, there we go, of her asking Papa for more coats, for her coat. In Boston one day, she had an unusual experience. While Papa and Auntie Hoyt waited out of sight somewhere, she had to go by herself into a large green room in a department store and listen to someone dressed up like Santa Claus read a Christmas story, and 'twas the night before Christmas. This seemed odd to her, for at Thanksgiving time she wasn't ready for Santa Claus. In Cranberry, they got through the turkeys and pumpkins and pilgrims before they brought out the Santa Clauses. She was quite relieved when the whole occasion was over, and instead of being abandoned, she found Papa and Auntie Hoyt waiting, beaming, at the door. They went on an underground trolley car in Boston, which went too fast around corners, and it was a wonder it didn't bump into the wall. For almost every meal, Auntie Hoyt gave them baked beans out of a can and cold-boiled ham, both of which Rachel was very fond of, but for which Auntie Hoyt apologized, saying hard times had hit her. In Boston, she also saw the Common, the Old North Church, the Bunker Hill Monument, and where John Adams was buried. It was all like walking through the pages of a history book. Could New York come up to this? The following year, when Mama took her down to New York, she saw that it could, but in a different way. It is true she had a number of ideas about New York before she got there, which came in for quite a reshuffling when she saw how things really were. For instance, she had expected the elevated railway to be a little train running on narrow tracks from pole to pole about half a mile in the air, really elevated. A sky train, she had thought, perhaps reached by ladder, and she had anticipated riding on it with the greatest delight. On the contrary, the elevated was so low down, the trolleys that ran over the viaduct from Cranberry to the city were almost as exciting. The subway, too, was not what she had expected. She had thought a subway would be a shining thing way down in the middle of the earth. But there, one merely had to go down a flight of stairs, and one beheld the subway. She did not see the escalator Papa flew up. But in New York, Rachel tasted her best meal she ever had in her whole life. She and Mama had walked for miles and miles and hours and hours. They had nothing to eat because on the train, Rachel had eaten up the hard-boiled egg sandwiches that were supposed to be eaten in some quiet park with the squirrels and pigeons. Her footsteps lagged. She was hot, hungry, and tired. Finally, her mother caught on and took her into a long, narrow store. She said afterwards it was the 5 and 10 cent store. There, Rachel was served this delicious dinner of pot roast and mashed potatoes and gravy and peas, and not too much, just enough on a little thick, hard white plate. Her dinner had cost 10 cents, Mama said, and it impressed Rachel that for either 5 or 10 cents, one could buy almost anything in New York. Here's a picture of her eating in that little restaurant. Even dresses, for after this wonderful little dinner, they went to an enormous place, and there for 10 cents apiece, Mama bought Rachel 2 dresses, a blue one and a brown one. And these were the first bought dresses Rachel ever had. Mama made all her clothes. Rachel loved the bought dresses. But when they were washed, they shrank up to nothing, and she had to give them to Thelma Ruby, her old doll. These were the only times so far that Rachel had been to either New York or Boston, and when they played the game as to which was more important, she still said Boston, so there'd be a game. Which is more important? Asked Jerry again, for it seemed Rachel had not heard the first time. A cat or a dog? Both, said Rachel, for this was like asking which was more important, a girl or a boy, and could not be answered. Said Jerry. September breezes stirred the branches of the huge horse chestnut tree that hung over the house. The stars were coming out, and the 2 children sat in silence. Then, stepping carefully over Gracie, not to make her move, Rachel reached for a horse chestnut that was glistening in the lamplight, and polishing it on her skirt, she sat down again on the bench beside Jerry. In the distance, shouts of children playing hide and seek could be heard. Then, because it looked as though Rachel might possibly have it in mind to get up and run around the corner and get into the hide and seek game, to keep her here, Jerry said, "Hey." Said Rachel. "I've been thinking." Said Rachel, and she waited. Thinking was more in Jerry's line than talking, but he finally blurted out, "Would Gracie be jealous if we had another pet, a dog?" "A dog!" exclaimed Rachel in surprise. "Yes, a dog. There's a puppy over at Speedy's barn, and they said I could have him for $1. $1, said Rachel. "Where'd you get the dollar?" "First," said Jerry, "would Gracie be jealous? That's what I'm asking you, not where I'd get the dollar." Well, there was silence for a few minutes while Rachel took this in. Then she said incredulously, "Is Gracie a pet?" Neither Rachel nor Jerry had ever petted Gracie because Gracie had no use for children, imagining they were just out to pull her tail. It's hard to know how she got this wrong idea, but she did have it, and the only person she had any use for was Mama. When she caught a rat out in the barn, as she did once in a while, she brought it to Mama, laying it proudly at her feet. If Mama didn't act as pleased as Gracie expected, she would neatly rip the rat's stomach open with her claws, so Mama would find it more tempting. Ooh. This performance, however unpleasant, was remarkable, and Mrs. Pye boasted of it to all the other cat owners who were not too squeamish to hear the tale. Naturally, the feelings of such an important cat and her position in the household had to be carefully considered before taking such a step as Jerry had suggested. "Is Gracie a pet?" Rachel repeated. "Of course she's a pet. If she's a cat, she's a pet." "Oh, I thought she was a member of the family." "She is, but she's still a pet." So now they were back at the beginning. Would Gracie, being a pet of the Pyes, be jealous if Jerry brought this puppy of the Speedies into the house? "Well," said Rachel, counting on her fingers to make her answer more important, "there are 4 of us, and none of us is jealous because there's more of us." "But we're people. I'm not talking about getting other people. I'm talking about a dog." "I don't think Gracie would be jealous of a dog," reasoned Rachel carefully, "because we're not jealous of Gracie, and we're people, and she's a cat, and she'll think about the dog the way we think about her. She might be jealous if we got another cat, like we might be jealous if we got other people, but she wouldn't be jealous if we get a dog any more than we would be." This sounded rather sensible to Jerry, and he looked at his sister gratefully. "Did you ask Mama?" asked Rachel. "No," said Jerry. "First I had to find out if Gracie would be jealous." Presently, Mama came out for a breath or two of air. She sat down in the little old red wooden rocker and fanned herself with a folded newspaper. Then Jerry told her he had a plan to buy this certain puppy of the Speedies for $1, since Gracie, as Rachel said, being a member of the family and a cat, would not be jealous of their having a new pet, a dog. "A dog," said Mama, and Rachel and Jerry saw with satisfaction that she showed the proper surprise. "Well," she said, "there had never been a dog in the Pye family before, only Mama and Papa and Jerry and Rachel and Gracie. Naturally, it came as a jolt to try and imagine life with a dog and when life had been going on so long without one. But Mama didn't hesitate long. She said it would be very nice to have a dog. And since Mama was Mama, she did not ask Jerry where he was going to get the dollar. Rachel did, though. She asked again where Jerry was going to get a dollar. Jerry muttered he wasn't sure just yet, so Rachel knew it was going to be a hard thing to do. It seemed to Rachel that by the time Jerry could get a whole dollar saved up, the puppy would be a grown-up dog. If only he had told them sooner, they could have begun to save long ago. They could have mite boxes such as those given out in Sunday school during Lent, and she and Jerry could have put their pennies in them. Soon there might have been enough to buy the dog. This way, though, since she had not told them until now, and since they did not want this puppy to be a grown-up dog before they got home, they would have to think of a quicker plan. Naturally, Rachel would want to help Jerry get the dollar, only she just couldn't think how, aside from the mite boxes, which were the only idea that had occurred to her so far. Even if there had been time for mite boxes, they were not such a good idea after all, she corrected herself. She had guiltily remembered the way hers always looked when she turned it in Sunday school, the slot for the pennies all stretched and torn from taking pennies out again. It was not a neat and tidy mite box the way Beulah Ball's was. It was a dirty, torn, loose mite box, and so was Jerry's. To tell the truth, Jerry was not at all certain how he was going to earn that dollar either, but he didn't doubt that he would find some way. If Papa's book that he was writing on birds sold a lot of copies, Jerry could ask Papa for $1. But that would be a long time before it was finished. The puppy would certainly be grown up and belonging to someone else before then. The book probably wouldn't sell a lot of copies anyway. It was for scholars. Papa was a great birdman, and for a few minutes Jerry thought proudly about him. He was off now on a trip to the Everglades to study birds in their habitat there. Men in Washington were always quoting Mr. Pyes' articles on birds. When some question on the conservation of birds came up, call in Mr. Pye was the first thing the men in Washington said. They would pay his fare to Washington, but that's all they would pay, aside from their respect. Outside of the family and the ladies of the far and near society who subscribed to the National Geographic and frequently saw his name in print, few people in Cranberry knew that Mr. Pye was such a famous birdman, for of course he didn't run around saying, I. It was thought that since Mr. Pye didn't work in an office or a factory and did not teach school either, he must naturally be wealthy, traveling all around the world the way he did. Nothing could have been farther from the truth. His pocket and Mama's pocketbook were almost always practically empty, so getting the dollar for the puppy from Mama or Papa was not to be considered. Rachel was thinking about Papa too. The way he loved birds, she thought. He could not bear to think of harm coming to any of them, and he pleaded with his neighbors to put bells around their cats' necks, the way Gracie had around hers. There were more belled cats in this neighborhood than anywhere else in Cranberry, and maybe the world. One day, Papa read in the paper that birds had rained on New York City, little birds that had missed their course in migration and bumped into the high buildings. Hundreds died. Papa had not been able to eat or sleep. He took a train down to New York to study the whole sad matter and make a report on it. The way Papa loves birds is the way I love, Rachel thought hard. The way I love birds too. She remembered she was going to be a birdman just like Papa when she grew up. She would accompany Papa on his bird trips, and when the big fellows in Washington said, call in Mr. Pye, they would add, and his little girl. Here's a picture of Mr. Pye looking at his birds in the Everglades. Whereas Rachel collected birds' nests and feathers and anything to do with birds that she could find, Jerry collected stones and rocks, and his room was filled with them. Picking up a rock when she and Jerry were on a searching expedition, Rachel would ask, is this quartz? No, Jerry would say. What is it then? Asked Rachel, because Jerry was going to be a rock man, a quartz man, when he grew up, and he knew everything. It's just a plain rock, answered Jerry. One thing, Jerry said so suddenly that Rachel started. Her thinking had wandered far off from the puppy and how Jerry was going to get $1. She said. This puppy that I'm going to buy for $1 that was born in Speedy's barn had his tail cut off yesterday. They all did. His tail cut off, said Rachel, horrified. Didn't it hurt? And he's not a whole dog then. He should cost less than $1. Mama said quickly, that's how they know how to cut off puppies' tails so fast that it doesn't hurt at all, and it helps the beauty of them when they grow up not to have a long, lanky tail. Most dogs I know have tails, said Rachel. Not fox terriers, said Jerry. I thought they were born without them. No, anyway, it didn't hurt, Mama said, affirmed Jerry rather doubtfully, for this was hard to take in. Since it had grown colder, Mama went into the house to get some typing done on one of Papa's articles on birds, and this one, the terns. And soon, clackety-clickety is all they heard her racing along. Rachel and Jerry sat a while longer, wondering how they could earn $1. Jerry only had until tomorrow night at 6 o'clock to raise $1 because Mrs. Speedy had said so. She said, I'd like for you to have this puppy because you're so crazy about it, Jerry. But there's somebody else who wants him too, and he keeps after me, you bet. Mrs. Speedy always put a great many you bets into her conversation, and the Pyes all called her Mrs. Speedy, you bet, or just plain you bet. He's always hanging around this other fellow, waving $1, Mrs. Speedy told Jerry, and the words were harping in his ears now. She also said, I said to him, if Jerry's not here by 6 o'clock Saturday, then you can have the puppy, you bet. When Jerry told Rachel this, she whistled. Whew, she said, we only have tonight and tomorrow. But the evening came to an end, and they went to bed with no idea how the $1 was to be earned. The only thing was settled was that Gracie the cat would probably not be jealous, and that the fact that Mama said it would be all right for them to have a dog. But there was all day tomorrow, and something surely would happen. At night, when Jerry and Rachel went to bed, they had the habit of making up stories, or rather one long continuous story that never ended. This story was all about the adventures of Martin Boombernickles, a character who could change himself into a horse, a boy, a man, a dog, anything whenever it felt like it. They almost never went to sleep without adding an episode. It was cozy in the night to hear Jerry call out from his narrow bed in his room to Rachel in her narrow iron bed in her room, the next room. Rachel, are you asleep? We haven't done an episode yet. Rachel never went to sleep before Jerry, even though she was a whole year younger, pinching herself to stay awake if necessary in order not to miss adding to the story. In delight, she would call out, "No! Oh, Boombernickles!" Because it was the one who said Boombernickles first who was allowed to commence the episode. Boombernickles had been going on for years and years. It was Rachel who had named it. "Oh, Boombernickles," she used to say whenever she had to do something she didn't particularly like. "Wherever did you get that word, Boombernickles?" her mother asked. "I don't know," said Rachel, but Boombernickles came to be the name of the character that could do anything in the nighttime story she and Jerry made up. Tonight, after the episode was finished, before he went to sleep, Jerry said, "Rach, I'll get the puppy, won't I? Something'll happen. I'll get the dollar, won't I?" "Sure," muttered Rachel drowsily. "Something will happen."